Welcome back. Soon after the Obama administration shifted its strategic priorities from Iraq to Afghanistan, Pakistan and America began to turn the page on its disastrous six-year occupation of Iraq. A rising tide of assassinations, suicide bombings, and tensions between Sunni militias and Shiite-controlled government have come back to haunt the U.S. and put a damper on its alleged successes in Iraq. Now, as America tries to apply the lessons learned in Iraq to Afghanistan and Pakistan, it might find itself applying the same failed strategies with horrific consequences. Before we discuss the regional and continental implications of Obama's wars, Rick Rowley examines Washington's role in the escalation towards civil war in Iraq.
It's 2009 in Baghdad, and the walls keep going up. As the American occupation enters its 7th year, Iraq remains in ruins, with over 1 million dead and 4 to 6 million refugees that have not begun to return home. Baghdad, a cosmopolitan center for thousands of years, has become a city of walled ghettos. What passes for peace in Iraq today is an exhausted truce and a terrible sectarian conflict. But how did the occupation turn into this? And what went wrong? April 2003, the new Iraq. Contrary to their predictions, the Americans were not welcomed as liberators.
It was a disaster. The American troops out there were acting kind of like robo-cops because they didn't know who the enemy was.
In spite of their religious differences, Sunnis and Shiites quickly united in a nationalist insurgency. By April 2004, 1 year after the fall of Baghdad, the U.S. faced simultaneous uprisings by Sunnis in Fallujah and Shiites in Najaf.
There was a feeling that we couldn't win that war. I had Marines say to me on patrol, "Hey, sir, don't you think they're really the nationalists and we're the invaders?"
June 2004. The U.S. military retreated in both Fallujah and Najaf, and the occupation quickly changed its course. A new team was brought into Baghdad, led by veterans from the Central American dirty wars of the 80s. The El Salvador option began to split the Sunni and Shia resistance against each other. Quickly organized elections were structured to bring the most sectarian Shiite Islamist parties to power, and their militias were incorporated into the Iraqi military and police.
I rejected the incorporation of militias into the institutions.
Even America's old allies were alarmed by the sudden change in strategy.
Unfortunately, when the Islamists took over, the militias were merged with the institutions. And this continues until now, to the extent that really, especially as far as the police is concerned, nobody can trust 100%.
Here at Camp Dublin, the Americans trained elite units within the Iraqi police with names like the Wolf Brigade and the Scorpion Brigade. Iraq's ruling Shiite parties quickly filled these brigades with their own militias. They are widely accused of committing torture and summary executions. Many consider them to be Shiite death squads, bent on purging the Sunnis from Baghdad.
The Salvador option basically depended on creating a local indigenous security force that would fight the insurgency.
Peter Moss wrote the first expose on the El Salvador option. He witnessed and documented numerous human rights violations.
The commandos were a very powerful weapon that were then used for extremely violent sectarian ends.
Another kidnapped, Anwar Yusuf. His arms were drilled and he had a bullet in his head.
Abu Wassam keeps a record of hundreds of dead from his neighborhood that he claims were victims of US-backed militias. He believes the Americans intentionally created a civil war to split the insurgency.
The Sunnis were attacking US forces, and the only way to shift these attacks was to change it into a fight between the Sunnis and the Scorpion and Wolf brigades, who were armed and trained by the United States. The Americans were the fuel of the sectarian violence in Iraq.
In the US, this violence was presented as part of a centuries-old sectarian conflict, and the American military was seen as a peacekeeper between the two sides.
It's not true at all. This all started as one of the great mistakes that the American administration committed in Iraq.
2007, the awakening. Sunni and Shiite insurgents had turned their weapons on each other, but the Sunni resistance continued to grow, and American strategy changed once again. the U.S. began to look for Sunni militia allies, and many Sunni insurgents, outnumbered and locked in a bitter sectarian fight, began to sign up. America's new militia allies called themselves the Awakening. Here in Taji, Captain Wogovath and his men used to face 3 attacks a week. They have not been hit once since the launch of the Awakening program.
It's safe.
Today, Captain Wogovath calls these men freedom fighters, but he knows that a few weeks ago they were called insurgents.
Every one of these guys shot at us at one time in our life. Oh, there you go. Look at the freedom fighters. Assalamu alaikum.
The Awakening may have bought a temporary lull in violence for the U.S. to announce its withdrawal, but this is a fragile truce without reconciliation. The past months have seen pitched battles between the Iraqi army and the Awakening militias, arrests of militia leaders, and an upturn in car bombings and mortar attacks on Shia neighborhoods. And the U.S. continues to arm both sides in the sectarian conflict.
Sai Hirsch, you are one of the early people who wrote about the ideas of death squads being used. You've also written that this has already been used as well in Afghanistan, seems attached to Cheney. Is this the kind of lesson we're talking about, learning from Iraq and applying into Afghanistan?
I'm afraid there's no question. You heard mention of the Wolf Brigade, and I know a young officer who is just an absolutely American officer who was being ordered to rotate into the brigade, and he refused on moral grounds, and he was basically told, your career is going to depend on you going in there. And it was done by a very high, very prominent general officer. Petraeus, no sense kidding around. You have to serve in this unit. What worries me the most is that we haven't learned any lessons. We are using what we call targeted assassinations against what we call high-value targets. And we have units, they're allowed to operate in as many as a dozen countries outside of the war zone, outside of Afghanistan and outside of Iraq. They're operating now, and they go into countries without telling the American CIA station chief or the American ambassador. They go in sterile and they kill people. And the intelligence they use is probably as good as the intelligence that we use to collect people at Guantanamo. And we now know that more than at least half those people had nothing to do with anything. So it's a very, very horrible situation that is not easy.
Mr. Brahimi, you served for the UN. This is certainly not a UN type operation, but let me ask you. You were talking about no military solution. With a country like Iraq, 1/3 of those killed, according to Iraqi human rights organizations, were assassinated, tortured and assassinated. Absolutely. How can you transform a country? How can you find solutions when tens of thousands are assassinated?
There is no doubt that the militias were incorporated into the police and also into the army. And as a matter of fact, most of the police was really composed of militias and are still answering to their militia bosses rather than to the state. You can't build a state that way. We come back to the idea that all this is one global war on terror. So it's the same war in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and wherever yes. you start shooting. In Iraq, Petraeus has said again and again, and I think he's totally right there, yes, some security improvement has taken place. It's real, but it is fragile and reversible. And I think unless a lot of other things happen, the worst of the civil war is still to come.
Well, certainly this last several weeks have been quite a scene in Iraq with escalation of violence, bombardments, assassinations, and so on and so forth. And what we know, Mr. Nawaz, is that we are applying that deadly strategy, that failed strategy in Iraq, into Afghanistan and Pakistan.
General Petraeus also has said famously that you can't shoot your way out of an insurgency. And much of history tells us that most insurgencies tend to last a pretty long time, 15 years, 25 years in many cases. But what you really need is to demonstrate the effect of good governance. And my only guess is, and this is now we are waiting for the implementation of the new Obama strategy, the guess is that they are trying to buy some space and time with the surge, although they're not calling it the surge, so that they can create certain zones in Afghanistan where you can actually provide local security with much faster training of Afghan police and Afghan forces.
Well, Mr. Ali, back in Montreal, it seems this kind of an outsourcing of the war towards the locals, like what we've seen before, a Vietnamization in the 60s and the 70s, and what we saw as the Iraqization Are we going to see more Pakistanis and Afghanis killing one another on behalf of America?
Well, I think it is going to be difficult. What was astonishing that when the United States occupied Iraq, they disbanded the only force that could have maintained some law and order, which was the Iraqi army. They never did that anywhere before. In Germany, in Japan, and in Italy, they basically got rid of the top brass and preserved the military structure because they needed it. In Iraq, they didn't care about that, so they created the mess. They can't repeat that in Pakistan. It's virtually impossible. The military is far too strong, and were they to try it, the people backing them within the Pakistani army would be marginalized very rapidly. Afghanistan, again, is a different operation because the bulk of the population are Pashtuns who are now totally alienated and hostile to the United States. What they should be concentrating on is an exit strategy, not seeing it in terms of victory or defeat, but how to extricate the United States and its allies from an unwinnable situation.
Mr. Ali, I'll turn to Mr. Ibrahimi on that. But it seems, if anything, and certainly if there's going to be no more of the same from Iraq to Afghanistan, Pakistan, it's going to be once again the test of NATO. And as you know, NATO is not exactly excited. It wasn't excited about Iraq. It's not exactly excited about Afghanistan, Pakistan. So what is America to do then?
NATO did not do well at all in Afghanistan. I think they have demonstrated that away from their natural environment in Europe, they are not much use to anybody. What you need is really redefine what you are doing there, not try to fix the old policy. I think it has to be a totally different proposition.
Well, how about an exit strategy?
The exit strategy is for you to say that what you are doing there is helping the people of Afghanistan rebuild their state. You are not fighting a war against anybody anymore.
Mr. Hirsch, is there an exit strategy, you think? Are they thinking about it in Washington, as far as you know?
Mr. Brahimi said something as an American who has 130 or 40,000 of my fellow Americans in the field in Iraq. You said the worst is yet to come. What did you mean by that?
In Iraq, what you have is sectarian violence, violence between Arabs and Kurds, violence between Kurds and Kurds. You have opened a Pandora box, and you have not put together a real process of putting the country back together. And what they did is dissolve the army. They dissolved also the state.
Go ahead, Ali.
As a result of that, they have made Iran the strongest regional player. They can't now do without Iran, either in Iraq or Afghanistan.
They handed over Iraq to Iran. And now they are asking Iran to kindly come to give it back.
Well, Mr. Nawaz, as director of the Asian Center, what we've heard just now, so we're stuck in Iraq, it might get worse. It's certainly getting worse in Afghanistan. It appears it's going to get worse in Pakistan. Tension in the nuclear question with Iran is certainly on the rise. Fragile states north of Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Kazakhstan, and so on and so forth. What's to become of Asia and Asian security? This is supposed to be the Asian century.
Well, I think the answers will have to lie within those countries, and they won't come from outside. Now, within Pakistan, there is still hope.
But yes, please.
If I may, you know, again, to be fair to the new administration here, there is a significant difference with what was happening before. And that is that one has the impression that they are not only trying, but starting to ask the right questions. They don't yet have all the right answers. But I think this is very promising.
But applying the successes of Iraq in Afghanistan, you think that's the right?
No. No two situations are alike, and therefore no prescription that has worked. I mean, if you say that it has worked, which is perhaps doubtful about Iraq, even if it had worked in Iraq, you are not going to just take it from there and apply it in
But once again, with the deja vu part of all of this, they're scaring everyone, especially American public opinion, from the fact that the extremists and the evildoers are going to take over Pakistan's nuclear weapons.
Well, the people controlling the weapons are probably the very competent, and the SSG, are very, very solid people in Pakistan. There's not a hint of jihadism or jihadi boys in the crowd. And so in the short run, I think the answer is that it's not an immediate problem. But there is, I have talked to American people who talk about what they call the long game of Al-Qaeda, you know, the long reach, that they're waiting. And I had a very senior American intelligence officer say to me about Al-Qaeda in the Hindu Kush, he said, this is an area where everybody knows what's going on in the next valley. In 8 years, nobody's told us a thing about bin Laden, even though there's a $50 million or a 25, whatever it is, price on the head. What worries me is what Mr. Brahimi said about Iraq. I think I think we may have a new Saddam. He's a Shia named Maliki. I hear terrible things about what's going on in the prisons there. I hear terrible things about they've gained access to some of the awakening lists that we use when we pay the Sunni awakening forces, and we have the biometrics of these people. We have their DNA and their eyeballs, and some of these names have been made known to the Shia police or militia, whatever. I'm sure they're basically the same thing. And there's a lot of killing going on now, Shia versus Sunni, and in the long run, it's very gloomy, and the way out of there is not clear at all.
Mr. Tariq Ali, back on Montreal, do you think the other Asian powers, the Chinese, the Russians, the Indians, even the Iranians, do you think they're going to let the situation escalate and America take root there with NATO in Pakistan, Afghanistan, as they did in Iraq?
Well, I know for a fact that the Chinese government has privately made it very clear to all concerned, especially the Pakistanis and even the Indians, that they will not tolerate permanent US bases in Afghanistan on their border. One underestimates, because the Chinese don't speak up in public, one shouldn't underestimate that they have a lot of influence in Pakistan where it matters, inside the military. So I think whatever short-term gain these countries might be interested in, they will not favor a permanent presence or a semi-permanent presence of NATO in the Hindu Kush. This notion of Al-Qaeda as a permanent danger is greatly overrated. Look, these people, 3,000-4,000 strong, if that, are no different, in my opinion, though far more deadly in some ways, than small armed struggle groups who existed in different parts of the world for most of the 20th century. The question is, how do you deal with that? And the answer is, you stop the flow of recruits to these organizations, and the only way you can do that is not by war, but by constructive political solutions. The more wars, the more the existence of Al-Qaeda or its growth becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And one would have thought that 10 years almost since 9/11, most of the US military and political establishment would have understood that.
Well, Mr. Ali, on that note, and gentlemen, we're going to end with a bit of an insight into the colonization of Afghanistan before I come back with my last word.
Afghanistan is on its knees. 3.5 million people here rely on food rations, and just 22% of the population has access to clean drinking water. But what Afghanistan does have is Coca-Cola. Coke's sparkling $25 million Kabul factory was opened with great fanfare by President Hamid Karzai.
This is a great day, and we are very happy that our great country, Afghanistan, makes another step forward for economic growth, self-sufficiency and better living standards.
The plant has the capacity to produce 15 million 24-bottle cases a year. It is on sale right around the capital, but just how many bottles store owners actually sell is another thing. This bottle would cost around about 35 Afghanis, approximately 70 cents, and there are many, many Afghans who simply couldn't afford it.
We can't buy Coca-Cola. I can't afford it on the money that I earn working on the street.
We don't have drinking water. What are we supposed to do with Coke?
They should make water hand pumps. What good is Coca-Cola to us?
I like to teach the world to sing.
It seems a giant step from the airbrushed optimism of Coke's most iconic brand statement to the brutal reality of one of the most war-torn and poverty-ravaged countries on the planet. But to Western business and their partners in Kabul, the very presence of this most American of icons is a real symbol of change Afghanistan should believe in. Only time will tell if it is truly the real thing.
The American media has been awash with reports of mistreatment of women in Afghanistan and Pakistan that demonize the Taliban. But flogging a Pakistani woman in public doesn't justify wars that kill, maim, torture, and displace millions. It is no coincidence that war-cheering media don't report how the Taliban banned the widespread pedophilia in Afghanistan and forbade criminal drug trade that destroys its society. There is no doubt that Taliban's social norms are an affront to modern universal values. But when Laura Bush and Sherry Blair spoke of the war to liberate the women of Afghanistan, they helped promote their men's war, not women's rights. If Western wars liberate Eastern women, Muslim women should be the most liberated in the world after centuries of imperial wars. They are not and won't be as long as liberty is associated with Western domination. Women are the first civilian casualties of war. Iraq and Afghanistan, now nations of widows, 5 million and counting, according to some reports. It is scandalous, decades after exposing the sham of the white man's burden with the blood of millions, to justify more of the same violence under the pretext of a white woman's burden. Those rightly outraged by the Afghan proposed, later withdrawn, medieval law that sanctions rape in marriage need to remember that marital rape was until recently legal in the likes of the United States and the United Kingdom. As for the first and foremost victim of abuse of power, women are uniquely positioned to reject the most destructive of all power abuses, wars. While some women enlist in the military to attain equality with men, I agree with those who want to undo a man-made world of wars altogether. Either way, men don't go to war to save women. They go to war, according to leading war historian Martin Van Creveld, to run away from their wives and families. Not exactly a women's cause. Thank you for watching.